One of the drawbacks of using static IDs is the fact that they have to be unique, meaning that if you want to duplicate a component, you need to change all the IDs inside the component. So that's the IDs themselves, any scripts that access states using script accesses, and any flows in the from and to keys, you need to change those every time. So to counteract that, we have scoped IDs that makes it easier to reuse components and also just easier to think of IDs for your components. So you don't have to start getting creative with appending numbers to your IDs just to keep them unique. So in this example over here, we have a dashboard, a single page with a light gray background, and we have a container with some properties applied to it, like border radius and shadow. If I open the dashboard, just collapse everything we don't need to see right now. Here we have our container, the one with the properties we just mentioned, and it has an ID of container. We also have a label inside it, and an input, and the input has a flow to the container's background color, meaning that if we type into it, the background color of the component changes. So if we wanted to duplicate this, copy this entire one. Now we have two. What you'll see is that we only have one of these rendered, and in DevTools you'll see an error, encounter two children with the same key container. So what we would do to fix that is, of course, changing the ID. So let's give this one, the first one, an ID of container 1, change the flow to container 1, and this one container 2, and the flow container 2. Now we'll see it is rendering, and both of the flows are working. But we don't want to keep doing this. We want to use scoped IDs instead. That just makes it much easier to work with. Because every time we change this component, we need to change the ID there and there. But components can be much more complex, and you would have to change potentially dozens of IDs. So what we'll do is, let's remove this one for now. Remove the ID. We don't need it anymore. We'll add a scope instead. The scope will be container. And now we can change this. Instead of just saying container, which is an ID, it is now a scoped ID. So we need two pipes around it. Now it still works. So whenever you have a scope, instead of an ID, you use the pipes. So it's pipe, pipe, ABC, pipe, pipe. You can think of scopes as units or kind of single entities that encapsulates many features or functionality or components. So if you look at a design, anything in which there are more than one, for example, if you have a situation where you have a sidebar menu, there are many menu items. If the menu items are fairly complex, like you have an icon, a label, and potentially so some styling and scripts applied to it, you'll very likely give a scope to each menu item that's being rendered. We also have the ability to further drill into scopes to give IDs inside scopes. So I should just make a copy of this one just to illustrate that it does still work. So now we have two with the scopes over there, ABC, this one, and ABC for this one. So now we have two, and both should work. It's always best to think of scopes, like I said, as little units by themselves, little entities. And whenever you access a scope, it's very important how you think of how that scoped ID is resolved. The word is resolved that we use for figuring out what the correct ID is. That's done at runtime. So if we have a scope here, it's called the scope A. I'll write this in red. If we have a scope in this container called A, scope in this container called A, anywhere inside this, inside a script or inside a flow, when we access pipe A, pipe. So this could be in some child component. Let's say we have another container inside and maybe an input inside that. Same situation over there, container, then an input inside the container. If we access pipe A, what's going to happen in the browser is it's going to start looking for the owner of A. Of course, there are two owners of A, this one and this one, but the way in which it searches is why it works in our case. So what it does is it starts on the component that needs to resolve the scoped ID. So in our case, we have an input that's accessing the scoped ID. So it starts here on the input and then goes up in the tree until it finds the owner. So we see, are we the owner? No, we're not the owner. We look at our parents. Are we the owner? No, we are not. We go to our parents, and then we finally find the owner for the scope. Then it knows that the ID is whatever the ID of this is at runtime. Internally, Opus will take care of this, but it does find the owner. In the same case over here, if we're trying to access the scoped ID A, we see, are we the owner? We are not. Our parent is not, and there we find it. If I were to access the scoped ID outside, you will see that it will stop working. So to illustrate this, I'm going to add a button over here. A fire script for a button with actions and just a set state. And of course the target. So we have a button, it changes the background color. Let's just make sure we can see our button. There it is. And we want to modify a scoped ID being ABC. We want to change the background color, and let's make it black. So clicking it now does not actually work. These still do work, but this button does not do anything. And that's because it's trying to resolve from outside. So if we look at our dashboard, there's our big dashboard with our two containers inside it. We have a button that's outside of these two. I'll just draw it at the bottom because I don't have space right now. So let's say we have our button with some text inside. When we click it, it's trying to resolve pipe A. It checks, am I the scope owner? I am not. It goes to my parent, which is this one. It's not the owner. It goes to the parent. It sees that it's the last parent. There's no other parents for it. And then it tries to find a single owner. So it tries to find all owners first, and then tries to make sure that we have only found one. So when it reaches this point, it says, okay, give me all the scope owners for A. It finds this one and this one. Because there are two, it doesn't work. What you will find is if you remove one of these, so just delete this one, now it will work because it only finds one. So with the absence of this one, it goes to the parent, doesn't find anything, and then finds all the scope owners and just finds this one, meaning it does work. Please note how we can access the scoped ID in flows as a to or from in your flow, and also in scripts as a target of a set state. We can also use them in triggers on a source for a trigger event source. And as mentioned, we can also drill in deeper for scopes to further define IDs. So then to illustrate that, what I'm going to do is let's change this button. Instead of changing the background color of the container, I want to change the background color of the input. So again, in the past, what we would have done is give an ID of input. Now we can target it with our set state. The target is input. The key is background color. Let's make it red. And clicking the button now does change the background color. Of course, if we duplicate this, then we have a situation again where we have two inputs that have the same ID, and we can't even see the second one because of the error you'll see in your console of duplicate IDs. So what we can do now is specify relative IDs. So for our input over there, we're not going to define a scope. because the input itself isn't a container of many other features, isn't let's call it a grouping of components in the same way that this one is. So it makes more sense to put scope there. Like in our example earlier, where we discussed with the menu, if we have a sidebar with multiple items inside it, and each one of those maybe has an icon, a label, then we would put the scope over there, because these are the things that are repeated. In the context of this component, we have multiple of these, which is why we've put the scope on those. But inside this one, we do not have multiple labels or multiple inputs, or maybe multiple icons or whatever it may be, which is why we don't give a scope to the input. Instead, we give it a relative ID, rel ID in camel case. So let's do it for the top one and the bottom input because we have duplicated this container. Now what we can do is we can change our set state to be, again, the scoped ID. Let's just change ABC to container again. So both of these now have a scope of container. So we need a scoped ID, container. That's the scope we want to access. But we don't want to change the background color of the container. We want to access the input inside it. Now we can say .rel ID, the relative ID we want to access, and that's in this case its input. So we access a scoped ID because it's in double pipes, and it's scope.relative ID. So note how you can either specify it this way if you want to access the scope owner, or you can specify it with the relative ID as well. Scope.relative ID. Now again, when we do click it, it does not work because it finds multiple. But if we were to move this button out into the container, there's the one, there's the second one. Now we have a button for each. Now clicking this does affect the correct component because, as you mentioned earlier, it goes up in the parent chain until it finds the scope owner, and then from there it will find the relative ID inside that scope owner. Scoped IDs can become a very complex topic, specifically when you come to where scoped IDs are being resolved. But as long as you remember the simple pattern of how Opus will try and resolve IDs, you should be fine. And that's the concept of no matter where you are in the DOM, the document object model inside the browser, if you want to resolve a scoped ID, it tries to find the owner by going up until it finds the scope owner, and then it will drill in if you want to access a relative ID to find that relative ID inside the owner.